Michigan, 1984-1985. Michigan, in the mid-1980s, carried a particular kind of quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that settles over places people believe they already understand. Small cities and suburban stretches blurred together, bound by routine, familiarity, and an unspoken trust in normalcy. Doors were locked at night, but fear did not dominate conversation. Danger, when it came, was assumed to come from elsewhere. That assumption shaped everything that followed. Christina Castiglioni was 19 years old in the summer of 1984. She stood at the edge of adulthood with the impatience of someone who had waited too long to be taken seriously. She worked when she could, saved when she remembered, and talked constantly about leaving Michigan someday, not out of desperation but curiosity. Christina wanted more movement, more color, more life than the familiar roads she'd grown up around. She was outspoken without being reckless, confident without being careless. People noticed her when she entered a room, not because she demanded attention, but because she carried herself like someone who expected the world to respond. Kimberly Luiselle was 15 years old in 1985. She existed in a different phase of becoming. Where Christina projected certainty, Kimberly carried questions. She was observant, thoughtful, and still learning where she fit, inside the boundaries drawn for her. She followed rules more often than she broke them, not out of fear, but habit. People described Kimberly as easygoing. What they meant was that she didn't cause trouble. Christina and Kimberly did not grow up together. Their paths crossed through proximity, shared spaces, overlapping routines, mutual acquaintances common in places where everyone knows someone who knows someone else. They were not inseparable. They were not mirror images, but they shared something critical. They lived in environments where familiarity was mistaken for safety. Christina disappeared first. In 1984, she was last seen on a warm evening that carried no warning signs. She had plans, loose plans, the kind 19-year-olds make without calendars or confirmations. She told people where she was going in the casual way that implies return. No one panicked when she didn't come home that night. They assumed delay. When morning came without word, concerns surfaced, but slowly. Christina was an adult. She had independence. She didn't always check in. By the time she was officially reported missing, the first window had already closed. There were no signs of struggle, no abandoned vehicle, no witnesses who saw anything dramatic. Her disappearance blended into the background of ordinary life. Investigators leaned quickly toward a familiar explanation. She must have left. That conclusion required no reconstruction, no urgency. It fit the cultural logic of the time. Young woman, restless, capable of choosing distance. The case cooled before it ever heated up. A year later, Kimberly Luiselle vanished. Her disappearance did not look the same, but it would be treated similarly. Kimberly was 15, which complicated the narrative slightly. She was not legally independent, but she was old enough, authorities believed, to leave voluntarily. That belief carried weight. Kimberly was last seen in daylight, heading somewhere familiar. She didn't take much with her. She didn't leave a note. She didn't tell anyone she was planning to go anywhere permanently. But permanence was assumed anyway. 2 disappearances, 2 different ages, 2 different years, 1 shared response, minimal escalation. Investigations into both cases remained separate, treated as isolated events rather than connected possibilities. There was no task force, no cross-referencing of environments, routines, or locations. Christina's files sat in one cabinet, Kimberly's sat in another. Time passed. Christina's case slipped into dormancy first. Kimberly's followed soon after. Both were technically open. Neither was actively pursued. Michigan continued moving forward. Families aged. Neighborhoods changed. Memories softened into fragments. The absence of answers hardened into resignation. What no one recognized in the 1980s was that the distance between Christina Castiglioni and Kimberly Luiselle was smaller than it appeared, not in relationship, but in circumstance. They disappeared within a year of each other, within the same regional footprint, under assumptions that prevented deeper scrutiny. Those assumptions would hold for 40 years. Because silence is powerful when no one challenges it, and Michigan would not challenge it, not until time itself made the old explanations impossible to defend. Michigan, 1984-1985. The first hours after Christina Castiglioni disappeared were filled with assumptions rather than action. People remembered seeing her earlier that evening, laughing, relaxed, unhurried. Nothing about her behavior suggested fear or urgency. That normalcy became the foundation of the explanation that followed. She must have gone somewhere by choice. When her absence stretched into the next day, family members contacted authorities expecting alarm. What they encountered instead was restraint. Christina was 19, legally an adult. There were no immediate indicators of foul play. Investigators asked routine questions, checked the obvious locations, and documented the disappearance with professional distance. There was no neighborhood canvass, no reconstruction of her final movements, no attempt to identify who last spoke with her, beyond a cursory note that friends saw her earlier. Her personal belongings remained at home, clothing, cosmetics, photographs, untouched. Her identification was missing, but that detail was treated as expected rather than suspicious. What mattered more was what she didn't take. No luggage, no savings, no long-term preparation. But preparation was not required for the conclusion investigators preferred. As weeks passed without sightings, Christina's name drifted toward the margins of official concern. Tips came in sporadically. A girl seen at a bus station, someone resembling her in another town. But none were pursued with intensity. Each unverified sighting reinforced the idea that she was alive somewhere else. Absence became evidence of choice. By the end of 1984, Christina Castiglioni's case was already cooling. The file reflected quiet confidence rather than urgency. The language used in reports suggested expectation of eventual contact rather than fear of harm. And then, in 1985, Kimberly Luiselle vanished. Her disappearance unfolded differently. But the response echoed familiar patterns. Kimberly was 15, and that distinction initially created the appearance of seriousness. Her age triggered a faster report. There were early searches, brief canvassing of nearby areas, conversations with classmates and neighbors. But even then, hesitation crept in. Kimberly was described as responsible, mature for her age, capable. Those descriptors softened the perception of vulnerability. They reframed risk as autonomy. Investigators questioned whether she might have run away, a possibility raised quickly, almost reflexively. She hadn't packed belongings, but she had expressed occasional frustration with routine life. That was enough. Her case, too, began to orbit the idea of voluntary departure. There were inconsistencies that should have slowed that conclusion. Kimberly left behind personal items she valued deeply, objects tied to identity rather than convenience. Her routine stopped abruptly. School attendance, social interactions, communication patterns. There was no gradual withdrawal. Still, the narrative hardened. 2 cases, 2 young women, 2 different years. The same logic applied twice. What authorities failed to do was compare. They did not overlay timelines. They did not examine shared locations. They did not ask whether proximity meant more than coincidence. Christina and Kimberly had both disappeared within the same regional corridor. Both vanished without warning. Both left behind lives mid-motion. And both were quickly framed as people who chose distance. That framing shaped everything. Search efforts narrowed prematurely. Leads that suggested external involvement were deprioritized. The lack of obvious violence became proof rather than absence. Families felt the shift. Christina's relatives noticed how quickly calls were returned less frequently. Kimberly's family felt the same subtle retreat. A polite distancing that signaled lowered expectation. Nothing was officially closed, but everything slowed. As months passed, community attention faded. New stories replaced old worry. Christina's disappearance became that thing that happened last year. Kimberly's became that other case. Separated by time, separated by files, connected only by silence. What no one acknowledged was that Michigan's sense of familiarity had overridden its sense of caution. These disappearances didn't fit the image of danger people expected. There was no stranger lurking in shadows, no visible crime scene, so the threat was imagined elsewhere. That assumption would endure for 40 years, because once a story settles into place, it resists being moved, even when the ground beneath it shifts. Christina Castiglioni and Kimberly Luiselle disappeared in different summers. But the moment their cases were treated as isolated, something critical was lost: the opportunity to see pattern. Michigan, 1985 to 1995. When investigations stall, they don't stop all at once. They thin out. What happened to Christina Castiglioni and Kimberly Luiselle was not a dramatic collapse of effort. There were no public announcements declaring defeat, no press conferences admitting uncertainty. Instead, their cases entered a quieter phase, one defined by paperwork rather than pursuit. Christina's file, by early 1985, had been reduced to maintenance. Tips were logged, sightings were noted, follow-ups were conditional, not urgent. Investigators revisited the same assumptions repeatedly, each time reinforcing them. She was 19. She had freedom. She may have wanted distance. Those three ideas formed the backbone of the case narrative, and everything else bent around them. Kimberly's case followed a similar arc, but with an added layer of contradiction. She was 15, officially classified as endangered, but that classification weakened with time. Each passing week without physical evidence shifted perception. The urgency attached to her age gradually gave way to speculation about intent. The term runaway began appearing more frequently in internal notes. It was never formally declared, but it hovered. That label had consequences. Once the possibility of voluntary absence was introduced, resources were reallocated. Search radius narrowed. Attention shifted toward juvenile services rather than criminal investigation. The same pattern emerged in both cases. The absence of violence was mistaken for absence of threat. What no one asked was why two young people, with no known connection, disappeared in geographically overlapping areas under eerily similar circumstances, leaving behind incomplete lives and unanswered questions. During this period, Michigan was not unfamiliar with crime, but danger was imagined as loud, obvious, chaotic. Christina and Kimberly's disappearances were quiet, and quiet cases were easy to misinterpret. Community memory faded unevenly. Christina's name still circulated among those who knew her personally. Kimberly's story lingered in school hallways and family gatherings, whispered rather than spoken aloud. But outside those circles, the cases dissolved into background noise. Records show that several tips came in during the late 1980s that hinted at external involvement. Reports of unfamiliar vehicles, mentions of interactions that felt off, descriptions that didn't fit the runaway narrative. None were aggressively pursued. Investigators were not negligent in the traditional sense. They were constrained by the framework they had already accepted. Every new piece of information was filtered through that lens. If Christina had chosen to leave, then sightings elsewhere were expected. If Kimberly had run away, then delays in contact were normal. This logic insulated the cases from disruption. Even when both families independently raised concerns about similarities, proximity, timing, unresolved leads, they were reassured that coincidences were common. They were told not to read patterns into absence. By the early 1990s, Christina Castiglioni's case was functionally dormant. It existed on paper, it existed in memory, but it no longer existed as an active investigation. Kimberly Luiselle's case lingered slightly longer, buoyed by her age and periodic interest from advocacy groups. But even that attention dimmed as years passed without progress. What replaced investigation was normalization. Files aged, detectives retired or transferred. Notes were rewritten in summary form, context thinned, urgency evaporated, and with each administrative update, something vital was lost. Nuance. Details that might have mattered later were condensed or omitted entirely. Timelines were simplified, witness recollections were reduced to brief statements. The past became flatter. During this decade, the world changed, technology advanced, investigative standards evolved. But Christina and Kimberly's cases remained anchored to the assumptions of their origin. No one reopened them with fresh eyes. No one questioned the foundation. The two disappearances remained separate, not because they were proven unrelated, but because no one ever tried to connect them. And that separation mattered, because patterns don't reveal themselves when stories are kept apart. By the mid-1990s, both families had learned a difficult truth. Waiting quietly produced nothing. They pushed, they asked for updates, they requested reviews. What they received were polite responses and familiar explanations. There's nothing new. We're monitoring the situation. If she wants to be found, she'll reach out. That last sentence lingered. It implied choice. It implied control. It implied silence was intentional. But silence can mean many things. And sometimes it means something is very wrong. The years that followed did not bring answers. They brought distance from the original events, from the urgency they once carried, from the possibility that someone had acted with intent. By the time a new generation of investigators entered the field, Christina Castiglioni and Kimberly Luiselle were no longer recent cases. They were old stories, cold ones. And cold cases are only revisited when something disrupts the narrative that put them there. That disruption would not come quickly. It would take 4 decades. Michigan, 1996 to 2019. Cold cases do not resurface because time passes. They resurface because something refuses to stay quiet. For Christina Castiglioni and Kimberly Luiselle, that something was not a confession or a dramatic discovery. It was persistence, uneven, uncoordinated, and largely invisible to the public. By the late 1990s, both families had learned to navigate absence. Life moved forward in fragments. Milestones were marked with hesitation. Every year without answers sharpened the same unresolved question. What was missed? Christina's relatives began compiling their own records. They reconstructed timelines from memory, cross-checking dates, locations, and conversations that had never been formally aligned. What they noticed first was geography. Certain locations kept reappearing. Routes Christina was known to use, areas Kimberly had passed through regularly. Places neither disappearance was officially tied to, but neither could be ruled out. Individually, those overlaps meant nothing. Together, they felt wrong. Kimberly's family pursued a different strategy. They contacted advocacy organizations focused on long-term missing juveniles. Through those networks, they learned something unsettling. Many disappearances, initially classified as runaways, were later reclassified when examined without original assumptions. That idea took hold. In the early 2000s, renewed requests were made for case reviews. These were not full reopenings, more like audits. Files were pulled from storage, summaries were reread, old notes resurfaced, And for the first time, someone noticed what had been absent. There was no confirmed evidence placing Christina or Kimberly outside Michigan after their disappearances. No verified sightings, no financial activity, no documented communication. The theory that both had simply left and started new lives had never been supported. It had merely gone unchallenged. Around the same time, advances in investigative methodology began influencing how cold cases were approached. Pattern analysis, geographic profiling, and data comparison tools made it easier to see relationships that manual reviews had overlooked. But technology alone does not reopen cases. People do. In 2012, a junior analyst assigned to archival review encountered both files within the same quarter. Not simultaneously, but close enough for memory to connect them. Two young females. Different ages, different years, same region. The analyst flagged the proximity, not as a conclusion, but as a question. That question lingered. Internal discussions followed, tentative, careful. No one wanted to imply prior oversight, but curiosity had been reintroduced. By 2016, a small task group was formed, not officially linking the cases, but exploring the possibility of regional connections among unresolved disappearances from the mid-1980s. Christina and Kimberly's files were placed side by side for the first time. What emerged was not immediate clarity, but discomfort. Timelines aligned in unexpected ways. Certain investigative gaps overlapped. Witness statements dismissed in one case echoed language used in the other. There were references to unfamiliar individuals, never fully identified, appearing briefly in both narratives. None of this was proof. But it was enough to challenge the idea of coincidence. The most troubling realization was how early the opportunity to connect the cases had existed, and how easily it had been missed. Had investigators in 1985 compared notes, they might have noticed patterns while memories were fresh and evidence was accessible. Instead, separation had allowed each case to stagnate independently. As the task group dug deeper, they encountered resistance, not overt but procedural. Old cases came with old conclusions, and revisiting them required careful justification. Still, momentum built. In 2019, the decision was made to formally reclassify both cases for comprehensive review. This did not mean an arrest was imminent. It meant the narrative was no longer fixed. For the first time in decades, the question shifted from "why did they leave?" to "what happened to them?" That shift changed everything. New interviews were scheduled, surviving witnesses were located, physical evidence, long boxed and forgotten, was re-examined using modern techniques. And with each step forward, the past grew heavier. Because the more investigators learned, the clearer it became that Christina Castiglioni and Kimberly Luiselle had not disappeared into separate stories. They had been folded into the same silence, a silence that had lasted nearly 40 years. And silences, once broken, have consequences. Michigan, 2019-2024. When cold cases move, they rarely do so loudly. They shift under pressure, administrative, emotional, historical, until something finally gives way. For Christina Castiglioni and Kimberly Luiselle, that pressure arrived quietly in the form of data. By late 2019, the task group reviewing unresolved disappearances from the mid-1980s had reached a point of no return. The parallels between the two cases could no longer be dismissed as circumstantial. The similarities were not dramatic. They were procedural. Both disappearances had occurred near transitional spaces, areas people passed through rather than stayed in. Both victims had last been seen following routine patterns. Both cases showed early investigative narrowing based on assumptions rather than elimination. And both had one shared flaw: the absence of follow-up where uncertainty should have triggered expansion. What finally forced a deeper reckoning was evidence that had been present all along. Archived property logs revealed items recovered years after each disappearance that had never been conclusively linked to their owners. In both cases, those items had been logged, boxed, and stored, but never re-examined once initial theories settled. Modern forensic testing changed that. In early 2020, analysts reprocessed material using updated techniques unavailable in the 1980s. Results were slow, methodical, uncelebrated, but they mattered, because what emerged was consistency, not identity, not a suspect, pattern. The locations where the items had been recovered formed a narrow geographic corridor, not random, not wide, specific. The corridor had never been examined as a single zone because the cases were separated by time and victim profile. Once viewed together, the implication was unavoidable. Someone had operated within that space, someone who understood routine, someone who relied on predictability, someone who benefited from early misclassification. As investigators pushed forward, resistance resurfaced, not from families but from the weight of precedent. Acknowledging connection meant acknowledging failure, 4 decades of it. But truth does not negotiate with comfort. By 2022, both cases were officially redesignated under a joint investigative framework. The announcement was not publicized heavily. It didn't need to be. The families were informed first. For Christina's relatives, the call brought relief and anger in equal measure. Relief that the case was no longer frozen. Anger that it had taken 40 years for the question to be asked properly. Kimberly's family felt something else entirely: validation. Because for decades they had insisted that her disappearance did not align with the runaway narrative. That insistence had been treated as grief rather than insight. Now it was evidence. As renewed interviews unfolded, witnesses recalled details they had once dismissed as insignificant. A person lingering too long. A vehicle seen more than once. A moment that didn't feel dangerous, just wrong. Those moments had been forgotten because no one had asked the right questions at the right time. That failure echoed through every new discovery. This is where the weight of the story shifts, because cases like these do not remain cold due to lack of information. They remain cold because attention moves on. And if you're watching this now, 40 years later, it means attention finally came back. That matters. Because every unresolved case survives on public memory. When people stop paying attention, pressure disappears, and so does accountability. That's why stories like this only resurface when someone chooses not to look away. If you believe cases shouldn't have expiration dates, if you think silence protects the wrong people, then staying engaged matters more than you realize. Subscribing isn't about content. It's about refusing to let stories like Christina's and Kimberly's disappear twice. By 2023, investigators were no longer asking whether the cases were connected. They were asking how long the connection had been visible. Internal reviews confirmed what families already knew. Early closure had been premature. The decision to treat both disappearances as isolated incidents had delayed meaningful progress for decades. That delay carried consequences no statute could erase. When the task group presented findings to oversight committees, the language was careful but unmistakable. The failures were systemic, not individual, but they were real, and once acknowledged, they demanded resolution. The uncovering of the case was not a single moment. It was a reckoning. A recognition that 2 young lives had been minimized by assumptions, fragmented by time, and nearly erased by administrative silence. That recognition arrived 40 years too late, but it arrived, and now the story belongs to the present. If you've ever wondered how cases stay buried for decades, this is how. Not through conspiracy, but through apathy. Watching this to the end, sharing it, refusing to forget. Those are the things that force systems to respond. Christina Castiglioni was 19. Kimberly Luiselle was 15. They were not theories. They were not file numbers. They were not footnotes. And after 40 years, their stories were finally being spoken together. One final question remained. Who benefited from their silence? Michigan 2024. Cold cases are not solved. They are confronted. By the time Christina Castiglioni and Kimberly Luiselle's cases reached their 40th year, investigators understood something fundamental. Whatever truth remained was fragile. Evidence had aged. Memories had eroded. People who might have answered questions were gone. What remained was structure. Patterns don't decay the way memories do. The Joint Task Group's final phase focused on reconstruction rather than discovery. They mapped movements, routines, environments, and decision points, not just for the victims, but for the system that handled their disappearances. And the conclusion was unavoidable. Both Christina and Kimberly had vanished during moments of transition, times when oversight was minimal, predictability high, and protection assumed rather than enforced. Neither disappearance was chaotic. They were quiet. That quiet had worked in someone's favor. The geographic corridor identified years earlier became the anchor point. Investigators revisited it repeatedly, overlaying historical records, traffic data, employment logs, and witness accounts. The goal was no longer to prove connection, it was to understand opportunity. Someone had been present, someone had access, someone had blended into normalcy so completely that no one thought to question them. What ultimately surfaced was not a dramatic reveal, but a reckoning with probability. The likelihood that two young people disappeared independently, under nearly identical conditions, in overlapping locations during consecutive years, without external involvement, collapsed under scrutiny. The narrative that had protected inaction for decades no longer held. In early 2024, authorities released a formal statement acknowledging that both cases were now considered linked and criminal in nature. That declaration mattered, not because it brought immediate justice, but because it admitted something long denied. Christina Castiglioni did not leave by choice. Kimberly Luiselle did not run away. They were failed. Failed by assumptions. Failed by timelines, failed by a system that mistook silence for consent. Families were briefed privately before the announcement. For them, the acknowledgement arrived with mixed weight. Relief that truth had finally pierced the narrative. Grief that recognition had come so late. There were no arrests announced, no courtroom scenes, no single name to carry blame. And that absence frustrated many. But the uncovering was never about spectacle. It was about correction. It was about restoring reality to stories that had been flattened into convenience. The final report outlined systemic missteps, early narrowing of theories, failure to cross-reference regional cases, over-reliance on age-based assumptions, and a lack of long-term accountability mechanisms. These were not accusations. They were lessons paid for with time. 40 years of it. Christina would have been 59. Kimberly would have been 55. Instead, they remained 19 and 15 in the public record. Frozen at the moment, attention drifted away. That is what unresolved cases do. They stop time, and they wait for someone to notice. This is why stories like this still matter. Not because they promise answers, but because they expose how easily answers can be delayed when no one insists on them. If you've made it this far, you already understand something many never will. Cases don't stay cold because they're impossible. They stay cold because people stop caring. Subscribing, sharing, and staying present is how pressure survives time. Silence is what allowed 40 years to pass. Christina Castiglioni, Kimberly Luiselle. Two names that were separated by paperwork. Two lives linked by oversight. Two stories finally told together. The uncovering did not bring them back, but it did something else. It refused to let them disappear again. and sometimes that refusal is the closest thing to justice time allows.